Hello and welcome to this live webinar and podcast recording today. I'm Aida Baghernejad, one of the hosts of 55 Voices for Democracy, a podcast produced by the Thomas Mann House and the Los Angeles Review of Books, where my co-host Tom Zoellner and I talk to leading intellectuals, activists, and artists of our time about how to renew the trust in our democracies today. And today is a particularly special day for us, as we are not only recording this conversation as an episode of 55 Voices live with an audience joining us digitally over Zoom. Hello and welcome. It is also part of Restoring Public Trust, a 4-day multi-platform program discussing concrete steps for restoring public trust in Germany and the United States. I'm right now in Thomas Mann's personal office here in Pacific Palisades. And Lawrence Douglas, our guest today, is in Berlin at the American Academy, which is a funny coincidence. I am beyond honored not only to talk to you, Professor Douglas, but also to sit at Thomas Mann's very own desk with his collection of Goethe's work right behind me with his own notes in the books. So I'm steeped in history right now. Unfortunately, however, I have to excuse my dear co-host Tom Zoellner, as he is serving as a juror in a criminal trial this week, which has unfortunately not come to a verdict yet. However, I still have our wonderful guest, so very excited to welcome you today. Lawrence Douglas, you are quite fittingly to Tom Zoellner's conundrum, one of the leading legal scholars in the United States. Welcome.
It's a real pleasure to be with you from Berlin.
You are the James J. Grossfield Professor of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought at Amherst College in Massachusetts. And you have written a number of nonfiction books, most recently, Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown in 2020. But not only that, you've also published fiction, among them the celebrated novel The Vices, as well as parodies and comedy. You have received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Institute of International Education at the Carnegie Corporation, served as a visiting professor of law at the University of London and the Humboldt University of Berlin, both institutions where I also taught at. And if that's not enough, you also contribute book reviews to the Times Literary Supplement, as well as to The Guardian, where you write about the legal side of US politics today. And it all makes me wonder whether you have unlocked the secret of getting more hours into a day. How do you do it all?
No, I don't think I've actually unlocked that secret at all. In fact, I think the one thing that's helpful is having a somewhat stressed temperament. And the feeling that I'm really actually not accomplishing anything. So I think that feeling of being dogged by a sense of needing to do more serves as a pretty powerful stimulation. But I do get in my 7.5 hours of sleep. I guarantee that.
That sounds fantastic on the one hand. Also, however, it makes me wonder a little bit whether maybe 9 hours would be even better for you. But that's another topic entirely. I want to say welcome to 55 Voices for Democracy and welcome everyone to our live webinar on restoring public trust. All the lovely guests tuning in digitally from all over the world, you are very welcome to ask questions. Please write them into the Q&A function and we will answer them at the end of our conversation today. But before that, I'm excited to ask my very own questions, as I have very many of them for you today after reading your books and also reading your powerful commentaries in The Guardian. And let me start with more of a global question, Lawrence. Democracy, and particularly trust in our political system, has been severely shaken in many countries of the global north in these past years. What has led us here? What has led us into this situation?
Well, certainly, I mean, there are multiple things that, and it's hard necessarily to say that what's contributed to the erosion of democracy in Poland or in Hungary or in Turkey is identical to the erosion of democracy in the United States. I mean, I think one thing that we can't overlook, if we look at the United States, is the siloed media environment. I mean, this is something that is familiar to many of us, but we do live now in a world in which the capacity to tell a lie has an incredible power to reverberate. I mean, I think at an earlier generation, you had a media universe which would immediately put a stop to the attempt of, let's say, at least a Democratic leader to tell lies. And now it's unfortunately the case that the avenues of mis and disinformation are so multiple. And I'm not simply, talking about someone like a Sean Hannity or a Tucker Carlson, though I do think that they exercise a particularly kind of toxic effect on the political climate in the United States. But it's also with social media platforms. There's just an incredible capacity for disinformation to quickly circulate, and not only to circulate, but to circulate in a highly siloed fashion, in the sense that people simply are not confronted with information that would challenge the somewhat preconceived notions that, or the work that's simply confirming their own preconceived notions. I think there's a lot of other, pathologies that we can talk about, particularly in the United States. I do think that, the incredible wealth gap that we have in this country, wealth gap that we really haven't seen since the early parts of the 20th century. There was that kind of dramatic division in wealth early in the 20th century. We saw, through the 1960s, a kind of narrowing of the wealth gap. And now we've seen, a really remarkable re-extension of that wealth gap. And I think that it's a kind of toxic force that is available for exploitation. And I think, you have people like Donald Trump and the minions who repeat his statements. It's not just Trump. It goes, right now to the entire Republican Party in many ways. It just, it attacks the soft underbelly of our democracy.
That is a very stark statement. And you just mentioned Trump, whom you wrote about in 2020, in May 2020, you published Will He Go? And in that book, you outlined a number of more or less catastrophic scenarios for the 2020 presidential election. For example, a situation where neither presidential candidate would have gained the 270, if I'm not mistaken, electoral college votes needed to win, and former President Trump would tweet relentlessly about a stolen election and how he could remain a force of constitutional chaos for years to come. In hindsight, reality and your predictions have come so dangerously close. Are you a clairvoyant, or how did you already see in the beginning of 2020 what would lie ahead for all of us?
It's an interesting question, because I don't think I have particularly good predictive powers. It is true, I will mention, that my wife did afterwards buy me a crystal ball. But I think the only thing, and it was interesting to me to see some of the readers of the book when it first came out. So it came out probably about 8 months before the election. Some people accused me of believing that the sky was going to fall. And in particular, they pushed me on the claim that I made, which was that if Trump loses, and again, it was an open question at the time whether he would even lose, but the claim that I made that if he loses, there is no doubt that he will refuse to concede. And people were saying, like, how can you say that? How can you say? And again, I don't think that was predictive. I think that was just following everything he said in the past. I mean, I think if you had at least, and I don't consider myself, with any kind of profound insight into the very complex psychology of the former president, but I think every statement that he made made us confident in the belief that if he lost, he would refuse to concede and would blame any electoral loss on fraud. And so I don't think I have any kind of great predictive powers as much as, maybe I simply believe the statements that people make. And he had been making those kind of statements for a long time, all the way back. In fact, one of the first times I became even interested in writing about Trump and the 2020 election was before the 2016 election. And this is a moment that you might remember, and many of the viewers might remember well. This was in the final debate with Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And he was asked by the moderator, Chris Wallace, he was asked, well, what would you do? What would you do if you lose? And he said, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. I'll leave you in suspense. And everyone was kind of horrified by that. And in fact, at that time, a lot of people thought, well, he just nailed his coffin shut. You can't do that in the United States. You can't refuse to acknowledge electoral defeat. And yet, he made it very clear early on that he was not about to go quietly.
Well, our political system is supposed to run on the consent of the defeated. This is something I thought, at least, that we agreed on in democracy. But did the Constitution try to make allowances for bad faith actors such as Trump? Has the Constitution left, a little door open for bad faith actors? Were we naive to believe in, the consent of the defeated?
Well, I guess I would say two things about that. I think maybe the first thing I would say is, I think for a constitutional democracy really to work is there has to be a normative buy-in by the main players in that system. And if you have people who are, leading actors in a system of democratic constitutionalism who are hell-bent on undermining the very system that they are acting in a sense, the system can never fully protect itself. So I think systems always need that kind of, and that's why I describe it as kind of almost this, the soft normative underbelly of any kind of system of democratic constitutionalism. You need to have people who accept the norms. I mean, if you think back to the election of 2000, remember this was the election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And Al Gore lost that election by 537 votes in the state of Florida. And he accepted that defeat. And he did it because he basically put the interests of the country ahead of his own, political fortunes. And, someone like Donald Trump is just refusing to do so. Now, did the framers of the Constitution, did they imagine that every president would be a good actor? And I think the answer is no. And they basically created two provisions. One provision is just the normal electoral process. That is, every 4 years, if somehow the president demonstrates that he is not they are not a reliable person, then they should be voted out of office, or unfit for office. They should be voted out. And if they engage in egregious acts during their time in office, then they can be impeached. And I think one of the things that is very disturbing about the Trump presidency is the way in which the impeachment mechanism failed. That is, I'm not sure that we can necessarily say in the wake of what we've seen with the Trump presidency that the impeachment mechanism is still an workable or adequate tool for removing someone from office who's clearly unfit for office and has clearly abused the office. I mean, we saw Trump basically survive two separate impeachment. I mean, he was technically, remember, impeachment is a two-step process. There is the voting the articles of impeachment by the House, and then there's the so-called trial by the Senate. So he was technically impeached by the House, but he was never convicted by the Senate. And I think that creates a terrible precedent.
I agree with you on that. And in an article for The Guardian in December 2021, you argued that the Republicans are plotting to destroy the United States from within. this is quite a stark argument to make, but looking at how the impeachment trial went, I tend to agree with you. Still, blaming one of the two leading parties of seditious behavior is quite a stark argument. What led you to this belief beyond how, for example, the impeachment trials went? Why do you think that the Republican Party has gone down this path of, maybe, if I can put it like that, bowing to the whims of the extreme right wing, or even bowing to the whims of conspiracy ideologists?
Right. Well, so maybe there's almost two questions here, which is like why they're doing this and are they really doing this? Is it an exaggerated claim to say that in important respects, the Republican Party is no longer operating as a democratic party, as a party that really is dedicated to our constitutional democracy? Now, obviously, that is a strong claim to make. And we can't completely overgeneralize. I mean, obviously, we see people like Liz Cheney. We see people like Mitt Romney. But on the other hand, look at someone like Liz Cheney. I mean, she's obviously engaged in, courageous act of standing up to Trumpism. And yet, what has that earned her within the Republican Party itself? It's earned her being deprived of positions of leadership. It's earned her absolute, clear censure and really kind of incredible hostility from within the party itself. And, one of the things that I think is one of the most, disappointing, and I think disappointing is an understatement, really alarming examples of the way in which the Republican Party has, in its mainstream, has kind of abandoned its commitment to democratic processes, is the way that they're operationalizing the big lie. I mean, we might have thought that, Trump's claim that this election was stolen, that the 2020 election was stolen through some vast democratic conspiracy, nationwide democratic conspiracy supported by the media. We might have thought that the Republicans would have said, no, too far. And even, you have people like, to his credit, it's hard for me to say this, but to his credit, Mitch McConnell, coming forward very clearly and forcefully and saying, that's ridiculous. This was a fair election, move on. But the tremendous number of of Republicans have bought into that big lie, and not just bought into it, but they've operationalized it. How do they operationalize it? Well, they've certainly tried to make Republicans on the state level who oppose the big lie pay for it politically, trying to oust them from their positions, and replace them with loyalists. And in a sense, loyalists even doesn't do the term service. It's almost like hacks who buy into this this lie. And a democracy really can't survive if people don't have any faith in the outcome of the electoral process. I mean, why would you accept the outcome of the electoral process if you firmly believe that it was the product of a vast conspiracy or fraud? And the question is that you also ask is why? Why are they doing this? And I think they're doing it in a combination of opportunism, true believerism, and fear. Fear in the sense that, if they don't buy into this, they're going to lose their own election, not necessarily the general election. I think what Republicans fear is that the base of the Republican Party is so powerfully controlled by the Trumpists that they would lose a primary. Mm-hmm. And so even if they could win a general election against a Democratic candidate, they'd lose a primary against a more radical Republican. And so it has led to this, dramatic radicalization of the Republican Party.
So in fear from a further radicalization of the party, even the more middle of the road politicians of the party have become more radical. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. And I think ultimately it becomes this kind of race to the bottom. And, it's something that you see so often in life, that you're fearful that someone else is going to, do something bad, that you feel you've got to preempt that thing by doing it yourself. And it does create this kind of race to the bottom. So, you have these people who probably deep down, if you ask them, in a private moment, do you really believe that there was a vast conspiracy on the Democratic Party to steal this election? They would say, no. But then in their public utterances, they feel obligated to repeat this, lest they get primaried by some more radical Republican who is able to wrap themselves in the cloak of Donald Trump.
But is there a way out of this race to the bottom, as you call it?
It's not easy, I don't think, because I think one of the things that contributes to this race to the bottom is certain, distorted or deformed features of our political landscape, namely the kind of hyper gerrymandered districts that we have in Congress. And we have to see how one thing kind of leads to the other. When you have these gerrymandered districts, basically in which it's almost a foregone conclusion that all you have to do is appeal to the voters in one party in order to win, it does create this kind of disproportionate power for the base of that party to control the electoral outcome of that particular district. And so, something that I think would be a wonderful thing is if we could have some kind of movement against the dreadful gerrymandering of congressional districts throughout the country. And I think that would create, at least that would be a helpful step towards kind of removing at least one big form of toxicity in our political life right now. Not going to be easy to do that, however.
Looking beyond the United States, on Sunday in Hungary, Viktor Orban won the presidency of Hungary again, also arguably due to gerrymandering. And maybe you could just explain quickly for our German audience what this extreme gerrymandering is that you just mentioned, because this is something that is less well known in Germany, although it's becoming more and more a feature of European politics as well.
Right. Well, I mean, imagine if you had some kind of area, and we can call the area anything. It would be a state. And let's say that state it's divided into 3 districts. And each district gets to elect one member of the House of Representatives. And let's say the districts are pretty evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. So, we can make this up. We can say something like every district has 300,000 Democrats and 300,000 Republicans. So District A has 300,000 Democrats, 300,000 Republicans. District B, same demographic breakdown. District C, same demographic breakdown. But let's say we can come along and you and I have the power to redraw those districts. And we're going to draw them in a very sneaky fashion, so that suddenly we're going to try to compact all 900,000 Democrats into one district, and then or at least to just move those numbers around. It wouldn't exactly work that way, but just kind of move the numbers around so that we're packing all the Democrats into one district, and then kind of just distributing the Republicans a little bit more aggressively in the other 2. Well, what that means is if you then have an election, it means that even though you have an evenly distributed electorate in terms of the state as a whole, the Democrats will win only one district and the Republicans will win 2 of those districts. So we've just kind of moved people around. We just said, you move over there. And if you think about democracy is basically a system in which 50 plus 1 wins an election. 50 plus 1 wins an election. What that means is I have an incentive to make you waste your votes. And when I say waste your votes, I mean, if I can make sure that you win your district 90 to 10 rather than 51 to 49, you've wasted a lot of votes because you only needed 51 to win, but you got 90. And I've now shifted my votes around so that, let's say, I win by 55 to 45, 55 to 45, 55 to 45 in all these districts. And then in your district, you win by 90 to 10. So you've won one, I've won a lot. And yet, if you look at the aggregate numbers, they look at the same thing. And again, maybe for the German viewers, one thing to bear in mind is the United States does not have a system of proportional representation. So that when I say we're looking at a District A and I get 55% of the vote, you get 45% of the vote, I get one representative, you get zero. So it's a winner-take-all system by district. Every district works that same way. Winner, winner, winner. Just by whoever gets the plurality of votes in any area. So it creates an incredible incentive for political parties to tamper with district lines in order to create a system of wasted votes for the other party.
But now these district lines have been drawn. So what can the public do to reward the gerrymandering that is present in the United States now? What is the way forward to move towards a more fair representation?
Well, I guess there are two possible ways. One is it is sometimes the case, so it's very, very difficult. If the gerrymandering has been done in a very, very egregious fashion, in a really horrendous fashion. So, for example, if there's clear racial discrimination behind the gerrymandering, then that can be challenged in courts. And you do have every now and again courts stepping in for the purposes of ruling a gerrymandered district in violation of law or unconstitutional. The other thing that voters can do, and it's happened in some states, is you can have these voter referenda. So voters get together, they make a ballot referendum. It's kind of like a grassroots democracy saying, we want the state to create an independent voting commission that will then be responsible for drafting basically nonpartisan electoral districts. And even that effort is available for constitutional challenge. But at least I think it's a very helpful effort. And you do see states actually with bipartisan support trying to create these independent electoral commissions. Now, again, independent electoral commission raises all these thorny questions as to who's going to be on those electoral commissions. But at least that's an effort to take the drawing of these district lines out of the hands of state legislatures who have an absolute political agenda to try to draw them in the most lopsided fashion possible.
So has the public have been won a challenge like that so far? Is there hope?
Yes, I mean there is hope, even though the hope might be a little muted with the Supreme Court that we now have. So there was a challenge. There was a voter referendum in Arizona, and in I think it was 2015, the Supreme Court reviewed the constitutionality of this voter referendum that established this independent electoral commission. And at that time in 2015, in a narrow 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court said, yes, that's fine, no problem. That's a constitutional thing to do. But unfortunately, one of the dissenting votes was John Roberts. And John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one thing that your viewers and listeners need to bear in mind is the Supreme Court in the United States right now is exceptionally conservative. You really have to go back to before 1937, to basically early years of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, to find a Supreme Court that's equally conservative. So whereas the Supreme Court upheld these kind of voter referendum in 2015, it's not clear whether the new composition of the Supreme Court, with the 3 new members added during Trump's presidency, whether they would vote to uphold these type of independent commissions created by voter referendum.
Mm. Thank you for mentioning the Supreme Court, because I also want to talk about the Supreme Court with you. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is expected to be confirmed this week and become the first Black woman Supreme Court justice. But her ascent to the highest court would likely not change these deep-sitting structural issues with the institution that you just mentioned, as it has become, as you just mentioned, so much more partisan in the past, say, 3 decades. So which changes would you propose to change the structure of the court and make it, again, less partisan and less politicized, maybe?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated thing. And again, one of the things I would really emphasize is it's not so much that it's partisan, is that it really is incredibly conservative. And by that, and the reason I want to emphasize that is because the Supreme Court, on some level, it's not meant to be a majoritarian institution. So it's not meant to be, susceptible to public opinion in the same way that, let's say, elected officials are supposed to be. But at the same time, it's not supposed to be radically out of touch with the American people. And the American people there's no doubt that they are more moderate than the members of the U.S. Supreme Court. And in terms of how to address that, it's not easy. One of the things I think would be helpful, however, is to introduce term limits to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court basically has life tenure. And on average now, the number, and this has to go, this is part of the fact that people just live longer these days, but the average tenure of a member of the Supreme Court now is about 28 years. It's a long time, 28 years on the highest court in the country. So in many ways, some of the most important things a president does is choose members of the Supreme Court. And given the fact that there's so much turning on the decisions of the court, it invites a very aggressive, partisan effort to try to rally the troops to get your person on the court, the person who's going to be most faithful to the political vision that you want to see represented on the Supreme Court. So I think introducing term limits would be a helpful thing. You might have to do that through a constitutional amendment, though. And if there's one thing, our Constitution is great in many respects, but not in all. And one of the things that is clearly defective about the American Constitution, unfortunately, is the way to amend it. The American Constitution is simply too hard to amend. Scholars have looked at this and they rank the American Constitution as either the single hardest constitution in the world to amend. Sometimes they put it in second place, but it's just too hard to do so.
Mm. Well, that's not a very hopeful thought, but also maybe still a way out. But let us talk about voting and voter suppression, which we mentioned before, and a topic that you have also written a lot about. We see efforts not only to gerrymander, but also to make voter registration more difficult. The reduction of ballot drop-off points, for example, the reduction of polling stations, or even making it illegal to give water to voters standing in line for hours, which was something that absolutely shocked me, to be very honest. In fact,
me too.
We agree on that. I think it's hard not to agree on this point.
Right.
In fact, the suppression of minority votes has been a feature of regressive politics for years. It's nothing new. It's been a feature of politics for centuries. But could these new contemporary vote suppression laws be used against Republicans one day who are trying to introduce them currently? Do they consider the risk for example, when they make voter registration more difficult, won't it come back and make it more difficult for themselves in, say, Trump-leaning Hispanic districts in Texas and Arizona one day? Isn't that very short-sighted?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the possibility that it could have this kind of boomerang effect. And I'm not sure if they're necessarily thinking in terms of the long term or as much as they're just thinking about 2024. And because, I mean, one thing we should bear in mind when you think about 2024 is, the 2020 election was not a close election. So Biden beat Trump by 7 million votes. That's a substantial victory. It's not necessarily a landslide, but it is a substantial electoral victory. But that said, Biden beat Trump by a total of 44,000 votes in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin combined. 44,000 votes in those three states. If those three states had gone for Donald Trump, we would have had an electoral college tie, 269 votes each. Disaster, absolute disaster. So I think what Republicans are looking at is we don't need to suppress 7 million votes. We don't need to suppress a lot of votes. We just need to suppress a small number of votes in these key swing states. And I think that's what they're thinking about for 2024. Now, is it possible that they could end up suppressing some Republican votes? Absolutely. But I guess their calculation is, and again, obviously it's a completely cynical calculation, but whatever suppression of Republican votes, they think they would have a greater effect on Democratic voters. And I think what's incredibly important come 2024 is to make sure that the Democrats do one incredible job of getting vote out, of making sure that they basically use the very devices the Republicans have introduced for the purpose of suppressing vote as a way of incentivizing people to get to the polls. So they don't, because so the Republicans don't, in a sense, reap the rewards of their attempt to disenfranchise people.
One way to disenfranchise voters is campaigning relentlessly against mail-in balloting, which has been done in the United States, particularly by right-wing pundits and even some politicians. And ahead of last year's general elections in Germany, we have witnessed similar attempts by right-wing politicians there too. So I would like to settle this once and for all. Is there a problem with mail-in balloting?
Yeah.
Great. But why is it something that's attacked in both in the United States as well as in Germany and in so many other countries? Why does mail-in balloting seem to be one of the first points of criticism for those who want to suppress votes?
Well, again, in the United States, if we look at it, it's not as if the parties that you have a bipartisan or an equally distributed attack on mail-in voting. I mean, the attack is coming from Republicans. And why is it coming from Republicans? Well, it was coming from Republicans, particularly in 2020, I think for two separate reasons. One was, remember, we're voting in a time of pandemic. And as we know, Republican voters, for whatever reasons, took the public health threat of the pandemic a lot less seriously than Democratic voters, which suggested that Democratic voters were going to try to avoid voting in person on Election Day. So they were going to rely much more heavily on mail-in ballots than were Republicans. Well, if you know that the Democrats are going to rely heavily on mail-in ballots to avoid the health risks associated with in-person voting, then you have every reason to try to stop the Democrats from being able to vote. And that's what the Republicans tried to do. They basically tried to, in a sense, poison the well of mail-in voting by saying it's not a reliable form of voting. It's something that's completely susceptible to fraud, which is simply not true. I mean, the number of cases of fraud associated with mail-in balloting is vanishingly small. And it's also the case, I guess. So I think that's basically the main reason behind the Republican efforts to suppress the use of mail-in voting. I think largely they associate mail-in voting with an instrument that is used more in minority communities. In communities, I mean, one thing we need to bear in mind in the United States, as opposed to Germany, the United States, we don't have a dedicated election day. That is, we don't have a day in which people have, either a Sunday or a national holiday in which people go to vote. And so I think what that means is that for people who are, working class people, it's going to be harder for them to vote than for others. And so they're going to use other techniques, such as mail-in ballots. So I think the Republicans was both something COVID related and also an attempt to sort of make it more difficult for working class people to vote, particularly if they have to travel a long distance simply to find a polling place.
As we mentioned before, I have so many more questions, but our time is slowly running out. Okay. So maybe one last question for me before we go to the questions that we have been asked in the Q&A function. Mm-hmm. Is there any hope for our electoral systems? How can we fix them and make them tamper-proof for the future?
Yeah, well, that's very hard given unfortunately, the electoral college system that we have now, it's a antiquated, dysfunctional, confusing, and ultimately dangerous system. I mean, at the most basic, an electoral system that can make the winner out of the national popular vote loser, it's just a defective system. And this is, again, where you have these two defects that are coming together. One, the Electoral College, which is clearly a defective system. And second, the way the process of amending the Constitution, which is too hard. And the reason I mention them in tandem is because the Electoral College is anchored in the Constitution. And people have been trying to get rid of the Electoral College. That is, American U.S. lawmakers have been trying to get rid of the Electoral College for a long time. The first effort to really get rid of the Electoral College came in 1816. So it's been recognized as a defective system for basically 2 centuries. And yet the problem is that the very states that are the biggest beneficiaries of this system would have to agree to abolish it. And they have no incentive to do so. And that would be the only way to abolish it by a constitutional amendment. Now, there is this effort right now to basically have states award their Electoral College votes not to the winner of the popular vote in the state, but to the national popular vote winner. And if that were the case, then you could make an end run around the Electoral College. And a number of states have signed on to that project, but not enough yet to basically make an end run around the Electoral College. But I think that would be a very healthy thing to be able to get rid of that. I mean, I think every fair-minded observer of American political system would say Electoral College has got to go.
I must confess, looking at the political system of the US from Germany and having taught the political system of Germany in other countries, this is exactly an answer I have posed myself many, many times. But thank you so much for now. Now we go over to the questions we have been asked in the Q&A function. Andreas Nietzsche asked, what are the chances of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact to take effect in enough states and at least fix the Electoral College bias in regard to the popular vote, which we just mentioned?
Right. So the thing that I was just referring to is exactly what the questioner is asking about. And so without getting too technical, if you can get states that represent 270 Electoral College votes, that's the number needed to win an election. If you can get states representing 270 Electoral College votes to sign on to this initiative, namely, again, to pledge all their Electoral College votes to the person who wins the popular vote, not in their own state, but to the person who wins it nationally, then you'd have an end run around the Electoral College. As of today, states representing 196 votes have signed on to that project. So that sounds, you might think, ooh, that sounds good. 196 electoral college votes already. You only need 74 more in order to basically get around the electoral college. True. But getting those next 74 is not going to be easy. And the reason it's not going to be easy is, again, because the states that are the major beneficiaries of the present system would have to sign on to this new system. And if you're a swing state, so if you think about this past election, the key swing states were Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania. The candidates give a huge amount of attention to the local interests in those states. And the states can actually extract promises from the candidates that, they will make sure, for example, that coal mining isn't taken away from Pennsylvania. And so it's in the interest of these swing states to basically maintain the electoral college system. So unfortunately, getting those last 74 votes will be very difficult, though, and it seems exceptionally unlikely that would happen before 2024.
Now we have about 4 minutes more, but 2 more questions. So from an anonymous attendee, what are your observations about public trust in Germany? What can Germany learn from the United States?
I find that the German system in many ways, obviously in Germany, you have a system of proportional representation. And, systems of proportional representation, they can have problems as well. You can have things where, the minority party in a coalition can exercise tremendous amount of power. I mean, one thing that we recently saw here in Germany that I can report on is the Free Democrats, part of this, the Ampel coalition, they've been able to exercise a lot of power to lead to the loosening of COVID mandates. So that in Germany, for example, as of May 1st, kind of shocking to hear this, in May 1st, people who are actively infected with COVID no longer need to isolate themselves. And I just read that in the paper today, and I was like, what? That's not a great thing. But again, that was something that the Free Democrats really pushed, and they were able to exercise a lot of power because their coalition partners need them to keep the government intact. But I'm not sure that Germany has a lot to learn from us at this stage, as much as perhaps the United States needs to learn from Germany. I mean, I do find it very interesting that things like Fox News or people like Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity, who I really do believe exercise a very toxic effect on American politics. You just don't really have that in Germany now. Now, I'm not sure if there's a lag time, but I know that, for example, the AfD, the very right-wing party in Germany, tried to create its own kind of television network, and I think it failed. So I'm not sure if Germany needs to be learning from the United States, or maybe the learning is supposed to be going the other direction at this stage in history.
Although there is an attempt to build a more Fox News-like TV station, Bild TV, which isn't going very well at the moment. But exactly. Of course, our media landscape is quite different. We have 2 more minutes. So one quick last question. Professor Douglas, asking from an anonymous attendee as well. Do you believe that Trump will run again in 2024?
Again, this is something where, when I started at the outset saying, like, I can predict that if he runs, he will do certain things. I'm not absolutely positive that he will run. But I think one thing he craves attention, and he does not like to be challenged. And I think that with any kind of challenge from within the Republican Party, from, let's say, a Rick DeSantis or something, he will try to destroy that person. And that will probably that might very well lure him into running again. And I think the only possibilities, I think there are 2 realistic possibilities. One is that he will run again, or second, he will try to basically hand groom a successor. But I don't think he would tolerate anyone who would try to take him on as the most powerful player within the Republican Party.
Thank you so much. We're also getting some criticism, but unfortunately our time is running out. Thank you so much, Professor Lawrence, Professor Douglas, sorry, for your time and for joining us today. Thank you all our listeners, whether you enjoyed this conversation or have some criticism about our points on gerrymandering, for sharing your time and with us too. If you want to listen to this conversation again, you can do that in a few weeks when it comes out as a podcast. And be sure to also join the other events during Restoring Public Trust, our 4-day multi-platform program. Thank you so much, Lawrence Douglas.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you.